In those days, time of Darwin and through to the 20th century, it was told by some people that you could never possibly have, say, an African being a professor of science or something, or government or anything like that, because they were not highly evolved enough. As I said, that's quite a touchy subject, but we're going to look at that, fruits of evolution, later on in the series. But just to show you the roots of some of these things. Swami Vivekananda was a famous Hindu expert and scholar who came over and wowed Britain in his tours, and also in America and Chicago. A quite extraordinary man, incredible memory he had, and he seemed to be one of these people that could dip into all sorts of things and memorize things so quickly. I wish I could do that. But this is something he said as a leading scholar representing Hinduism and speaking to the West. What is the cause of evolution? Desire. The animal wants to do something, but it does not find the environments favourable and therefore develops a new body. Who develops it? The animal itself, its will. You have developed from the lowest amoeba. Continue to exercise your will and it will take you higher still. The will is almighty. If it is almighty, you may say, why cannot I do everything? But you are only thinking only of your little self. Look back on yourselves from the state of the amoeba to the human being. Who made all that? Your own will. Can you deny then that it is almighty? That which has made you come up so high can make you go higher still. And that was a speech in London, 1895. And of course, the end product with evolution, once you go through all this evolution right through the whole lot, you end up with the spiritual evolution of yoga. And they have so-called 7 energy centers in the body, beginning at the base of the spine, right through to, you've probably seen Hindus with a red dot on their heads, the third eye. And enlightenment, where you become as God. You merge with Godhood. And that is the ultimate in Hinduism, and that's the spiritual evolution part of it. With Egyptian priests, philosophy and religious ideas. Babylon, the Chaldean priests, and the Persian magi, and others. Plato, and later we'll look at Aristotle, are key people in founding a lot of the Western understanding and philosophy. Now, Plato was a disciple of Socrates, and Socrates, we read in some of the ancient writings, debated with some Brahmin priests, Brahmin philosophers in the marketplace in Athens. Socrates himself believed in reincarnation, and some of the ideas you follow through Plato's writings, when he's speaking as a mouthpiece for Socrates, are very similar to the Hindu understanding. Plato was, of course, influenced by others. He went through studying different philosophers. Now, he said, in Timaeus, in his own writing, these are the principles on which living creatures change and have changed into one another. The transformation depending on the loss or gain of understanding or folly. Now, he understood, just as the Hindu Brahmins had, that living things can change. They are not fixed, but they change. They go through a process, there's a fluidity, they change. And he understood that, one to another. But he didn't have the kind of understanding we look about, Darwinian, with just purely natural selection and environmental pressures and so on. They were looking at something internal because they believed in a consciousness. Plato believed that God created the world, but it was the same, but the universe was also co-eternal, which is quite difficult to hold those two things together, but that's what he did. But he had very much this Hindu Brahmin concept, which followed through later on. Other scholars, when they looked at Plato, they realized that the influences, again, have come from a Hindu Vedantic school. And Sir William Jones, again, this is a quotation of him writing to a letter to Lord Monboddo from the Enlightenment here in Edinburgh. And he wrote, I have seen enough of it to be convinced that the doctrines of the Vedanta school are Platonic. Another chap, Professor Urwick from the University of London, said, I affirm very confidently that if anyone will make himself familiar with the old Indian wisdom, religion of the Vedas and the Upanishads, he will shake himself free from the academic attitude and limiting Western conception of philosophy, and will then read Plato's dialogues. He will hardly fail to realize that both are occupied with the same search, inspired by the same faith, drawn upwards by the same vision. Let's move on to Aristotle. he was a disciple of Plato. And many of his ideas, Plato, I think, thought he'd be a carbon copy and carry all his ideas through, which he didn't necessarily. A chap called Professor Arthur Lovejoy gave a series of lectures at Harvard University, one of the leading universities in America, in the 1930s, and he wrote this book, The Great Chain of Being, a study of the history of an idea. And what he did, and it was really nice to find this book, is he did my work tracing through Aristotle right through to Charles Darwin. And as I said, gave that series at Harvard. Let's look at Aristotle. Unfortunately, the first quotation, I was digging around, I didn't put it in there. But here's a quotation from Aristotle's writings. Nature gradually, step by step, developed from inanimate substances to living creatures. And again, other bloodless animals generate indeed, but from decaying earth and excrements. That's the same kind of concept that we had with the Hindus beforehand about spontaneous generation, living things coming out of non-living things in a progressive upward thing. And it was what was called the scala naturae, the ladder of nature, from the lowest forms to the highest forms up to humans. I won't read through that one, it's just a quotation of Encyclopedia of Philosophy, just confirming what I just said. And he was a pantheist, Anaximander, who said that animals come into being from moisture evaporated by the sun. Humans originally resembled another type of animal, namely fish. Now, you begin to get a few things you can recognize here concerning evolution. Empedocles, he was a chap that Aristotle quoted. And Aristotle says, Empedocles says that the greater part of the members of the animals were generated by chance. In other words, he went that it was not some consciousness, it was a chance, randomness process that was going on. And then he said that many races must have been unable to beget and continue their kind, for in the case of every species that exists, either craft or courage or speed has from the beginning of its existence protected and preserved it. There were two figures in the church, Clement of Alexandria on the left-hand side and Origen, his disciple, on the right-hand side. And even though they were Christians, what they did is they brought in an allegorical method of interpreting the Bible. And they brought with them some of the ideas of Plato and so on, that became essentially the door that opened up the way for the Egyptian priests, the Chaldean priests, and the Persian magi, and others. Plato, and later we'll look at Aristotle, Babylon, philosophy and religious ideas within the church. Later on, getting to the 1200s, Thomas Aquinas, a well-known monk from that period, wrestling as they were with a sort of a kind of revival of Aristotle and Plato's thinking, and he was trying to work it out and with philosophy and religious ideas. From Babylon, you had what's called a Trimurti, which is the gods of Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva. Now, for the religious people, they were seen as gods,